What's going on guys, Kadis here, and for today we are taking a closer look at the top 5 best tank builds in Albion Online. So first of all, there are two types of builds, which are offensive and defensive tank builds, and in this video I will explain what that means. Then what are the best weapon and gear choices for any activity in the game that you would need as a tank. And of course that means that all of these builds will be very good for ZVZs, 5v5 and open world PvP. And then later I will explain the playstyle for each build and much more. So all in all, if you are looking for the best tank builds ever, then this is the video for you. Then taking a closer look at the first one, which is the Grailseeker defensive tank build. So for the weapon of choice we go with the Grailseeker, and for the abilities you pick the second Q, 5th W and first passive. Then moving over to the helmet, which is the Assassin's Hood, and you choose the third ability and first passive. Then for the chest piece you go with Adjudicator's armor and choose the third ability and first passive. And lastly for boots you go with the Hunter shoes and pick the third ability and second passive. Then for my cape of choice I pick the Martlock cape, and for consumables I went with the Avalonian pork omelet and resistance potions. And as this is the first build in the video, I will explain some things that will repeat in every single tank build. But in all the next builds, we will just go straight into the playstyle. So first things first, for every tank build I will go with the Martlock cape, but it's optional. If you're a new player, you need to know that there are two best cape choices for tanks, which are Martlock capes and Fort Sterling capes. So I personally like Martlock capes more, and they are good for every single type of PvE/PvP activity, but Fort Sterling capes are better at ZVZs. So I personally always will go with the Martlock cape, but just so you know, you always have the second best option, aka the Fort Sterling cape, and that will repeat for all the builds in this video. And last but not the least, you can see that all my gear is tier 8.1 with 7.2 Avalonian omelet, but you don't have to worry about that because you don't have to wear such an expensive gear. So feel free to use any cheaper gear and consumables and the builds will work the same. So with that out of the way, let's move over to this build's playstyle. So as a defensive tank, your main objective is obviously to defend your teammates. Later on you will see the difference between offensive or defensive tanks, but besides the point, you have 3 weapon abilities. So your Q ability does a simple dash roll, where your character dashes and if he hits enemies they will get knocked back. And then your W hits all enemies in a cone in front of you, so they basically get stunned for a second. And then lastly we have the E ability, which will slam your staff on the ground and root all the enemies standing in it. So there isn't a one single spell combo that you should do, because as a defensive tank build you have to look for enemy attacks and with these 3 spells interrupt them. So what I usually like to do is keep on poking my enemies with the Q and W, and whenever I see a big attack incoming I use my E ability once. And if it's not enough, I'll use it right afterwards, the E twice. Because after using the first E, you have 3-second period which you can use it again, but it will double the cooldown. And then you have 3 more abilities. If you have played tank, you know that you want to run away or run towards the fights using the boots, aka the F ability. And lastly, to protect your teammates, use the R ability, which will create a force shield, and all allies standing in that shield will get very high damage resistance. And lastly, after you have used the E ability, don't forget to activate the D ability, which will do a small spell casting, and while that is happening your cooldowns will come back faster. So in conclusion, if you are in a ZVZ with this build, then stay in your backline and protect your teammates. But if you are in a normal open world or 5v5 scenario, then of course be in your teammates' front line and engage the fights with the F ability and use the E or W abilities to annoy the enemies and interrupt their spells. Then taking a closer look at the second build, which is the one and only camlann offensive tank build. So for the weapon of choice we go with the camlann mace, and for the abilities we pick the third Q, second W and first passive. Then for the head armor you go with the knight's helmet and pick the third ability and first passive. Then for the chest piece you choose the demon armor and go with the third ability and first passive. And lastly for boots you go with the hunter shoes and pick the third ability and second passive. Then for my cape of choice I picked the Martlock cape, and for consumables I went with the Avalonian pork omelet and resistance potions. Then as this is an offensive tank build, obviously your main objective is to engage and be the attacking player. So first things first, you need to know that there are 2 ways to attack an enemy with this build, and here in the gameplay I will use the spell combo on groups of mobs. So first things first, imagine that the mobs are players. So what you want to do is when you see players grouped up close to each other, use the E ability. And then if you aim it right and hit a player, it will pull all the other enemies to that one enemy you hit first. And this basically will clump up them super close to each other, so after you have used the E ability, all enemies are in one same place. So then you use the W ability and then right afterwards use the Q ability. So what this did basically with the W ability, you dash towards the enemies and root them in the ground again. And using the Q ability, you hit the ground and silence all of those enemies. So this E plus W plus Q spell combo just put your enemies in a kill zone, where now your teammates can use any ability they want and one-shot the enemy group. So for big attacks, which you coordinate with your teammates, you use the E plus W plus Q. And for smaller fights, just keep on using Q and W whenever the rest of the abilities are on a cooldown. And then lastly, we have the 3 defensive abilities. So the F ability is self-explanatory, that you use it to run into a fight or run away. And then the R ability is basically like a big reflect ability, which creates an aura, and in that radius, if enemies attack you, the damage gets reflected from you onto them. And then finally we have the D ability, aka the helmet, which by activating you become immune to stuns, slowness abilities and things like that. So when you feel big damage is about to hit you, use the R and D ability. And in conclusion, this is a very powerful ZVZ and just in general open world PvP build. And if you want to use the best of the best builds, then here it is. Then as for my third build, we have the defensive grovekeeper tank build. So for my choice of weapons, I went with the grovekeeper and picked the first Q, 5th W and first passive. Then for my helmet, I picked the Judicator's helmet and went with the third ability and first passive. Then for my chest piece, I went with the Guardian's armor and chose the third ability and first passive. And lastly for boots, you go with the hunter shoes and pick the third ability and second passive. Then for my cape of choice, I picked the Martlock cape, and for consumables, I went with the Avalonian pork omelet and resistance potions. And then as for the playstyle, as before I explained the objective of a defensive tank, so your main objective with this build is to slow enemies and defend your team. So first of all, every single time you hit an enemy with a Q, he will get slowed for 30%. And then when you activate the W ability, it will create a big circle in which if enemies step in, will get slowed for 90%. So basically, if you drop this W in a choke point, something like this, then enemies won't be able to move from one side to another. And then lastly, we have the D ability, which can be used as an offensive or defensive ability. So your E is a dash, which if you hit enemies in a range will stun them. And as for this build, you want to keep on using your Qs whenever you can, and as soon as you see your enemies grouping up and trying to attack you in front of your teammates, use the W ability and then dash towards them with the E ability. And this W plus E should stop your enemies in their tracks and completely destroy their engage attempt. So when you are in an enemy backline, use the R ability, which will create an aura in which enemies will do 60% less damage. And last but not the least, pop the D ability, which will create a pulse in a massive 11-meter radius, and anyone standing in that pulse will get stunned. So overall, this build is very strong and mainly meant as defensive tank. But of course, in smaller fights you still can be in a front line and attack enemies with the E ability. But then just don't use all the abilities at once and save some for enemy attacks. Then as for one of my last builds, we have the offensive soulscythe tank build. So my weapon of choice is the soulscythe, and you go with the second Q, 5th W and first passive. Then for the headgear you pick the Judicator's helmet and go with the third ability and first passive. Then for the chest piece you get the Judicator's armor and go with the third ability and first passive. And lastly for boots you go with the hunter shoes and pick the third ability and second passive. Then for my cape of choice I picked the Martlock cape, and for consumables I went with the Avalonian pork omelet and resistance potions. And then as for the weapons playstyle, we have basically a one ability which this build is built around, and it is the E ability. So as an offensive tank you want to attack and engage your enemies. So your goal is to use the boots, aka the F ability, and with that speed close the distance between you and the enemy. And then aim the E ability where players are grouped up and use it. And this basically will create a storm which if he hits, any player standing in it will get thrown in the air and slowed for 80%. So then afterwards, like any other tank build, you want to keep on using your Q and W ability, which will keep on stunning players and cancelling their spells, but just in a lot smaller range and duration. And lastly, like I explained in the previous builds, use the R ability to create a shield in which all allies will be protected and receive high resistance. And then to attack or defend your teammates, don't forget to use the D ability, which will create a pulse in a massive 11-meter radius, and anyone standing in that pulse will get stunned. So in conclusion, this build is very powerful and you won't be going in and jumping straight into the enemies like all the other tank builds, but instead you will be able to stun and annoy enemies from a lot further distance. So check this build out and have fun. Then for my fifth and final build, we have the one-hand mace tank build. So I gave you 2 offensive and 2 defensive tank builds, and this last one is just all around a good build for both playstyles. So then for my weapon I picked the one-hand mace, and for my abilities I choose the third Q, second W and first passive. And for my offhand, I picked the Leering Cane. Then for my choice of headgear, I went with the soldier's helmet and picked the third ability and first passive. Then for my chest gear, I went with the Guardian's armor and picked the third ability and first passive. And lastly for boots, you go with the Hunter shoes and pick the third ability and second passive. Then for my cape of choice, I picked the Martlight cape, and for consumables, I went with the Avalonian pork omelet and resistance potions. And then as for the playstyle, it is very simple, that there are no stacks or no big small engages that you need to worry about. You just simply decide on when you want to attack and then use the F ability to close the distance between you and the enemy. And then use the W ability, which will dash towards your target, and if it lands and hits players, all of them will be stunned. And then you want to dash to them again, so if you are already on a stunned enemies, wait a second or two and dash again, just this time using the E ability. And lastly use the Q ability to silence all of those stunned targets. And then as you are already in an enemy backline, use the R ability, which will create a red circle, in which enemies will do 60% less damage. To lastly protect yourself, use the D ability, aka the helmet, which will block any incoming attacks. So for this build I chose to attack at the start with the W instead of E, because they basically do the same thing, just one has twice as much cooldown as the other one, and using the spell combo, which is W plus E plus Q, will stun and silence enemies for a very long time. And by then, if you have decent teammates, they will finish off the players and you will win the fight. So in conclusion, this is a very nice and versatile build for PvP and PvE. So try it out and enjoy. So I really do appreciate everyone for watching guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions, feedback or different tank builds that you would recommend for other players to use, then feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. And while you're doing that, please click like, subscribe and enable that notification bell, so this way you could support the channel and you won't miss any more amazing content from me. With all of this said, you have an amazing day and I will catch you in my next video. So take it easy, peace.